Hey there, funky fortune tellers. Today's video is all about card combinations in terms of specific questions. And so let me say that better. So I am in a couple Facebook tarot forums for students who, can go in and ask questions and get peer advice and expert advice, etc. And one thing that I see a lot, and I don't tend to respond a lot because by the time I get around to seeing things, there's already like 100 comments. But one thing I see a lot are questions like, what card combination means this? Or what card combination means that? So one that actually stuck with me in the example I'm going to start with today is what card combination means imprisonment. And that one stuck with me for obvious reasons because it's a very sort of dramatic question. And so I wanted to just give you my take on this because I feel like when I started reading, I got the impression that specific combinations of cards always meant specific things, and that I would need to learn them and memorize them in order to be a good reader. And that felt really impossible, like an impossible task. In fact, somewhere behind me is a book about possible card combinations and their meanings, and I felt like, oh god, I'm never gonna, like, I had to learn 78 cards upright and reversed, and then I now have to learn what the different combinations mean in order to get anywhere with the reading. And that's ultimately not really the case. In fact, I've learned over time that the card, like, they all sort of, in answer to the question, like, what card combinations mean imprisonment or love or whatever, it's, in a way, they all do, and none of them do. And that's because, and this is something I've really appropriated from Camellia Elias, which is that the cards don't mean anything until they come into context of a question and each other. Up until then, they're just icons. They're just pictures on a piece of paper, and so they don't actually have any real meaning until they're forced into a situation with a question and other cards. And I really hold that to be true, which is one reason why I'm very much a stickler for having a question when you do a reading, particularly about something like this. So here's just a few thoughts on the topic in general, and I'll say this too. When you're going into a forum to ask a question, remember something I think that's really important, which is that the reading comes from the reader and the cards, not just the cards. There's no one way to do anything, and so when if you're a student and you're going and asking for advice from others, I would say, remember that you are an important part of the equation, and so it's important for folks to know as much about what you think as possible. I'm starting from, like, here's where I am and here's how I'm struggling with this, but here's what my instincts were. Because in that case, people can work with you and say, here's this little tidbit that you mentioned, and, like, I think the key to the reading lies in this thing, because you're part of the interpretation, whether you know it or not. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing I would say is, like, what is the question that you're actually asking? You know what I mean? If you're not asking a question, or if you're doing like a big general spread like the Celtic Cross, it's harder to get specific because you don't have as much context. You're not asking anything, and so the cards don't know how to interact and respond with you. And so really anything is possible. And if anything is possible, where do you start? Yeah. I mean, I guess if, we used to say in the corporate world, if everything's important, nothing's important. And I think that applies to a reading too. Like, if you don't narrow down your focus with a question of some kind, then you're just making your job so much harder. If everything's important, nothing's important. So how do you know where to start? Beyond those two things, I would say this. Go, look at the cards in front of you and think about them as literally as you can. Try to strip away, any sort of preconceived notions about them. For example, over the course of Tarot's journey, the Hanged Man has morphed, probably more than any other card, from a card representing a traitor being hung to a spiritual kind of endurance test, and shift in perspective. which is fine. But in a reading where you're asking about imprisonment, say, what you're really looking at with the Hanged Man is a prisoner suffering consequences. And so right then and there, you've got a pretty clear answer, looking at notes here. On the other hand, the magician also has had a journey from being a con man to being sort of the quintessential magus, as Crowley called him. The magician is a criminal who's free. The hanged man's a con man. So, just looking at the history of the card and looking at the purpose and function of the card can go a long way into telling you things like that. You know what I mean? The fool is free. The fool is going where the fool wants to. Justice punishes the legally guilty. So if this is a question of imprisonment and it's about someone who did do it, who's guilty, then the justice card is going to suggest that will be discovered and punished. The judgment card, on the other hand, is going to punish the morally guilty. So maybe no law was broken, but a moral code was broken, and the judgment card kind of reflects the moral consequences of a situation. Again, because justice depicts the law, and judgment depicts the sort of judgment of the deities, for example. The tower frees. For as ugly and dramatic as it looks, you're not being entrapped by the tower. It is crumbling. So there's freedom there. The Four of Wands, always gets associated with a happy relationship. It shows people boxed in. The Four of Swords shows someone in a tomb. So again, those are both cards that are boxed in, that are not free. And so those could suggest that just by looking at them. The 8 and 9 of Swords show people trapped in a situation. And even in Marseille cards, you can look at the images on the pips and see whether it's looking open or closed. Many, if not all of the Swords and Wands cards are very cagey. And so a lot of Swords or Wands cards in a reading could suggest entrapment or imprisonment, right? Because of the way they look. Whereas many of the coins and cups look very open and very free, but not all of them. Because there are cards in the cups and coins where the vines kind of entrap, and pull something, they enclose. And so, if there's a lot of enclosed cards and using Marseille cards, that tells you something. On the other hand, like the aces would bash anything caged up. There are cards where the sword cuts through the cage. And so, you know what I mean? Like even when you're working with Marseille, when you're looking at the pictures, then that gives you a sense certainly of what's going on. And then also, I'm not a big fan of one card readings, and so I would say, always go with 3 or more. I think that using 3 cards for each position, as Robert M. Place teaches in his book, is like the thing to do, because it gives you so frickin' much to work with. It gives you a whole story. You know what I mean? And so I have some examples. So if you look at the visual flow and the context of the cards, in like a Rider-Waite-Smith situation, consider, for example, this one, which is Justice, the Hanged Man, and the Tower. So we have like a really interesting combination here, because I talked already how the Justice punishes the legally guilty, right? So there's a thing of imprisonment there. We also have the Hanged Man, who is being sentenced, who's suffering the consequences of a crime. But then we have the Tower. So in that case, we have maybe a situation where there's someone who's guilty, who is going to be sentenced, or who is sentenced, and who does go to jail and is freed somehow, or escapes even. So the way that the cards interact with each other can tell you a lot too. And that's why I'm such a fan of the 3-card spread, because it's like literally magical when you're looking at them. If you just look at the cards and sort of step away from the situation a little bit and just sort of say, well, what's the interplay here? Another one takes those same 3 and reverses them. So then there's Tower, Justice, and the Hanged Man. And then that shows someone who thought they were going to go free, and at the last minute gets sentenced and suffers the consequences of it. You know, so the order in which the cards show up can show you, because the narrative changes. Now, I don't always read cards 1, 2, 3. Sometimes when I'm reading, like, the middle card will announce itself as the most important, etc. But you know, these are just examples that I played with as I was preparing for this video, in a rare kind of thing for me. I made notes, actually. So let's, another example is the Fool plus the Two of Cups plus the Four of Swords. So, we have 3 cards here that are traditionally considered pretty positive, right? The Fool, the Two of Cups, and the Four of Swords. But if you look at them very literally, you have someone who's free in a position of sort of saying goodbye and then going off to be alone in a dark environment. So again, there's a narrative there that speaks to this journey towards imprisonment. Now, again, like, how do you know? What do you don't really until you lay the cards out and you ask the question and you explore it, but this gets to the point that I try to make a lot, which is that all the cards are neutral. So even though the 3 cards, the Fool, the Two of Cups, and the Four of Swords, are traditionally considered pretty positive, in this case, they show a narrative of a free person saying goodbye and going off to be alone, And so, that's just the journey they take, which is not a positive situation. Now, in a person recovering from a relationship, a bad breakup, that might contextually be much better. They were free, they were in a relationship, they're alone, but they're peaceful. And so there's a time of healing that happens. So then the cards do take a different spin, but that's why context is so important. That and I feel like I haven't talked about context in a long time, but it's so fundamental to how we read, and it's why questions are so important. It just is so freaking key to reading well, and to getting specific and to finding out, what card combos are and mean what they mean, without having to resort to a list of tabling out every situation in the card combinations that could, come up from them. Because again, it's not about memorizing combos. It's about looking at the cards in context of a question, looking at the cards in context of each other, and sometimes just looking at them in a really literal way, kind of stripped back from any preconceived notions that we have about them. I always say every interpretation that we have of a card is a value judgment, which may or may not be appropriate in a reading. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's how we learn. But by the same token, it's also limiting in some cases. Because, for example, if the Tower is always negative, you lose the sense of freedom that we get from the examples that I showed you earlier. And so it's why I try to always start, even though I have 20 years of, like, the Tower is like this tragic collapse of systems, for example, when I lay them out, I try to say, okay, I try to, in a way, forget everything I know about them and just look at them and say, okay, we have Justice, the Hanged Man, and the Tower. And when I just look at those, I see law, consequences, and freedom, in context with each other. So that's I guess what I mean when I say, like, there is no good or bad. There is no positive or negative. There's no light and shadow until we have context. You can also do this, again, if you're reading Marseille, or even without it, if you're reading Rider-Waite-Smith, you can do this with the numerology, So, for example, let's say we have the Two of Wands or coins, the Five of Coins, and any 9. So for the way that, and again, this is going to depend on how you read the numbers, right? But for me, 2s have a magnetism to them. So there's a pull toward, sometimes there's a repulsion too. 5s are generally disruptive, and coins represent daily life. And then 9s are an endurance of something. And so the Two of Wands or coins, we have kind of life or passion there. The Five of Coins is a disruption of life, and then any 9 is something being endured. And the suit that the 9 falls in would tell you kind of what the feeling of the 9 is, but it's something being endured. And so there's a pull towards disruption. So the magnetic of the 2 and the disruption of the 5 of coins is a pull towards disruption of life, and then an endurance of something. And then that to me would suggest, again, contextually, if the reading is about like a legal case, something not going the client's way, probably some kind of consequences being paid. The 5 of coins, the 7 of coins, and again, any 9. So again, we know that 5 is disruption, coins is life, so disruption of life. 7s are interesting because that's a number that I tend to think pretty positively about. It's a lucky number. And for me, there's an introspection, there's a going within. But in this combo, what I thought about was that this going within means going within a bad situation, because then it's followed by the 9, which is endurance. So there's a disruption of life and a going into something that has to be endured. And so in that case, again, there's that feeling of being stuck or imprisoned. So these are just a bunch of examples of how context and just looking at the cards can tell you that, so that it's not about memorizing any particular set of assigned meanings. It's about allowing yourself to look at the cards that fall on the table and interpreting them in a way that makes sense. But this is impossible to do without a question. If you don't give some kind of bounding box, then you have no way of really knowing. And so if you're wondering about the outcome of something legal and you want to do a reading about it, I would say, just get as specific as you want to be. I think that ethically that's a much better thing to do than doing some sort of roundabout way of trying to read about something without breaking some self-imposed rule, you know what I mean, and getting a fuzzy answer that may or may not help. If you're gonna read about this kind of thing, just read about it. Don't pussyfoot around. Just do the thing. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. You know what I mean? Now, if you're giving legal advice, that's going to be a problem if you're not a lawyer. You know what I mean? But that's not what we're doing here. We're talking about how do we know a spread of cards represents imprisonment of some kind. I'm using a legal example because that's where my mind went when I saw this, but it could mean a relationship that's bad. You know what I mean? It could mean any number of things, being stuck in a job, whatever the case is. This idea of imprisonment is contextual to the situation, but all of these contextual clues tell us that someone is being stuck in something. And the same goes for other what's the word I'm looking for? Situations, other themes. Thank you, me. So, for example, let's say we're not talking about imprisonment, but another thing that's common, maybe more common, in card reading is love and marriage, right? So which cards would suggest a love connection? Again, we go just to a very basic place, looking at the majors, for example. So the Fool ain't sticking around for anybody. The Fool is that gangster of love. They're going wherever they want. And the Magician is a liar. So maybe they are sticking around, but they're not telling you the truth because they're a con man. The High Priestess and the Hermit are both loners. But on the other hand, the Empress, the Emperor, they're partners. So even if they're not partnered in a reading, they are both partnered. Part of their being is being partnered, so there's that. The Hierophant kind of in a weird way represents the institution of marriage because it's a religious rite. The Lovers, of course. Even the Devil, there's partnership in those cards. And certainly the Devil is a card that I often associate with sex and sexuality. Strength, temperance, those can suggest partners coming together and sort of endurance. We know the Two of Cups, the Three of Cups, the Four of Wands all have that tenor to them. So, again, looking at the specifics, looking at the kind of generalities, starting from the beginning of the cards, looking at them from neutral. And then, again, with the Four of Wands, that's, considered a card of marriage because it looks like a wedding. But then just letting them speak to you. And then again, working in combinations, which I love. So let's just look at a couple. What I'll do is I'll put up the combination and give you a second to come up with your... In fact, I'll give you a second to pause the video, come up with your interpretation, and then I'll share mine. But I'll say this too. This is just an example. Like, you don't, like, if you come up with something different, obviously that's just because you're a different reader. It's not, this isn't a test. I just thought it would be a fun thing to do. So let's look at the first one. So in terms of what is the narrative of these three cards suggest when the theme is love or marriage. So you have Justice, Temperance, and the Tower. So go ahead and pause. Think about Justice, Temperance, and the Tower and what that might mean for a relationship. So pause. So for me, we have a legal bond with Justice, and Temperance blends things. So there's like a nice little legal bond that is blended and goes along, but then the Tower comes along and crashes it. So it's like a sudden kind of like blonk to the relationship. It doesn't last. How about the Two of Cups, the Nine of Wands, and the Strength? Again, with a theme of love and marriage. Two of Cups, Nine of Wands, and Strength. Go ahead and pause. So for me, that suggests, a coming together of people who know that the relationship is work, but they have the strength to do it. So it's kind of the opposite. It endures beyond what most relationships do because they recognize that it's labor. It takes effort. How about this one? We have the Two of Swords, the Nine of Swords, and the Fool. So go ahead and pause. Two of Swords, Nine of Swords, and the Fool. In that case, I saw someone who's really stuck in their head and afraid of commitment and running away. So that's where that went for me. And then, you can do this with numerology. So just to give you an example again, because everyone's is different, and I generally suggest and encourage people to find their own path. So the Two of Wands, the Five of Cups, and the Ten of Cups. So for me, again, I talked about that attraction of the two, the disruption of the five, and then tens have finality and endings to them. So oftentimes in Rider-Waite-Smith, the tens kind of represent the culmination of a suit and kind of the happiest outcome, specifically with coins and cups. But they can also represent endings because it's the end of the line. And so the Two of Cups, the Two of Wands, the Five of Cups, and the Ten of Cups, to me suggests a mutual attraction, but people who are emotionally unstable and a blowout and ending at the end. So that's, that's that. So, don't as you're learning feel like, oh, I have to memorize all these meanings. I have to memorize all these combos. It doesn't really work that way. And in fact, that gets, I think, in the way of really seeing what the cards are telling to you and really coming up with a shared language, which ultimately I think card reading is. It's you're coming up with an agreement with the cards that you're going to listen to them, but you're also going to give them context and bounding boxes so that their meanings are restricted and you don't have a situation where if everything's important, nothing's important kind of thing. So really just look, it's really just about being tenacious when you struggle and experimenting and saying, what am I really seeing in these images? What am I really seeing with these associations? What am I really asking is the other thing. What is the question? And if the question has nothing to do with imprisonment, why would you look for it in the spread unless there were context clues that said that you should be? For example, if you're reading about a bad relationship, that would make sense. But if you're reading about something that has nothing to do with that, you want to look for the context clues that give you what you are asking for so that your job is easier and your answers are better. And I really firmly believe that the cards drawn answer the question that you asked and nothing else. Especially when you're starting out. I have heard stories and I have had experiences where the cards drawn seem to talk about something completely different and are like an alarm bell about something. That has happened to me maybe twice in my 20 years. But for the 99.9% of the time, the cards are answering the question that you asked, and that's it. And if you want to know another answer, you ask another question and do another spread for it. So I hope this was helpful. I really encourage you to experiment with this too. Do this yourself. Think about a theme and go through the deck as you know it and say, what would this card mean in that context? What would this combo of cards mean in this context? And just play. And then draw 3 cards and then replace one of the 3 with another and say, what would this mean? Change the order and say, what would this mean? And these are all things you can just do when you're I want to play with the cards, but I don't know what to do today. This is a great way to practice. So I hope you're well and healthy. I hope you're taking care. And we'll talk soon, my friends. Be good.